And it's my pleasure to introduce Logan Jaeren, who is a resident here in Washington State. He's a professional software designer, but we invited him here today because he's also the founder of a cool organization called STEAM4SPACE, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to sparking curiosity and inspiring student educators. And through STEAM4SPACE, Logan shares the unique stories behind mission patches, which he's going to share some of those with us today. And he also encourages students to use storytelling and art to create their own patches. And his organization has a lot of resources to help educators and students do that. Logan has collected and donated over 46,000 real mission patches and has distributed them to over 1,000 educators, okay? So all Artemis Roads 3 challenge teams that are requesting supplies are receiving mission patches from STEAM4SPACE to help you guys feel inspired to create your own mission patches. Many of you guys here today probably already received these patches. So I hope that some of you guys maybe even brought them with you today. And please join me welcoming Logan and thanking him for spending some time with us today. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to you, Logan.
Thank you, Darcy. My pleasure to be with you here this day. I've got stories. I'm a storyteller, but let me kind of do a little bit of intro on myself. So I started, I've been a lifelong enthusiast in space, and I have been collecting patches seriously for the last 7 years, but my grandfather worked on the Apollo spacecraft as an engineer throughout the Apollo program. He also worked on the Space Shuttle Columbia before it flew. And so in that time, while he was working on these spacecraft, he collected patches for me and gifted them when I was like 7 or 8 years old. And so I've always been intrigued by patches since I was a kid. And you know, life took over, and then I finally got back around to looking at these patches and was really, really curious about the design and the origin story. That's what I'm going to share with you today, is the stories about these patches. So I might be able to answer some of the questions for you on behalf. So in my collection, I have over 5,000 patches in my personal collection. They're all related to space. And so it's like, how could there be 5,000 patches related to space? Well, I'm going to share some of the insights as to how that is possible. And as Darcy, eloquently described, I started STEAM4SPACE to be able to get real patches into the hands of students through educators around the world, to be able to share my stories, but also to get you to hold onto these patches and look at them for real. So there we go. So I grew up in the age of Apollo and the early years of the space shuttle missions. And so these are the Apollo mission patches that my grandfather collected and gifted to me when I was a kid. And I want you to take a quick look at these patches, and you'll notice a few things. You'll notice that most of them are round. There's a few that are different shapes. And I want to call your attention to Apollo 8 is the triangular patch in the center. There's only 3 patches in NASA history that take on that shape. One of those happens to be Artemis, the Artemis 1. But back in the day where Apollo 8 flew, Apollo 8 actually is the shape of the Apollo command module. That's the shape of the patch. It's also the color that it was when it was wrapped up and transported. But look at the number 8. The number 8 actually is convenient because not only was it Apollo 8, but it was also the path that the astronauts took to the moon and back. So that was a source of inspiration and insight into the design. Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. Apollo 13 is the one that has the Roman numerals XIII, has the horses. Those are the 2 patches that have no crew names on them. And it turns out that the Apollo 11 crew decided not to put their names on the mission patch because over 400,000 people were involved with getting them to the moon. 400,000. And Apollo 13, turns out James Lovell, who's the commander for that mission, didn't think the crew names looked really good. So he took the crew names off. So, the crew get to decide what their mission patch looks like. Of course, NASA has final approval, but the crew get to decide what it looks like. So Apollo 11, I'm going to tell you something that very few people know, even in NASA, unless they're historians, and I'm going to make you a little bit of a historian. Apollo 11, it's got a planet-size error. There is something really, really wrong with Apollo 11. It is the most iconic patch that has ever been created, because it's the first time that people stood on the moon for the first time. But the shadow, look at the shadow on the Earth. Look at the shadow in the craters. They were drawn wrong. They were not actually supposed to be drawn that way. And so the question is, well, where should the shadows be? Well, here's an example of what the shadow should be on the Earth. And Michael Collins, who is the command module pilot for Apollo 11, acknowledges that that was a mistake. He's an engineer. He wasn't a scientist, but he made that mistake and he acknowledges that mistake. And I actually love the fact that some patches are not perfect. There's errors. And Apollo 11 actually has an error, but I wouldn't be able to tell you that story unless there was something wrong with it. But now you know something about that patch that few people know. Now, my favorite mission patch, because I'm a child of Apollo, my favorite mission patch is Apollo 13. I honestly couldn't tell you why. I used to draw these as a kid. You used to trace them out and color them on paper. But I think I like the horses, although I've only ridden a horse a couple of times. But I actually think it's a pretty cool patch because it has animals on it. And Apollo 11 had the eagle. But 3 horses for 3 crew members who flew on that mission. And the horse on the right-hand side, some people say that that's Jim Lovell because the horse's head is down. Jim was really disappointed he didn't get to land on the moon because it was his 4th and last space flight. The other 2 horses are looking up and looking out, and it turns out Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert, the other 2 crew members, were like tourists. This was their first space flight and first time around the moon, so they were happy to spend as much time at the window looking out. So that's kind of my interpretation of it. But as it turns out, because there was an explosion on that mission, and they didn't get to land on the moon, and that mission changed from one of landing on the moon to being survival. Since that Apollo 13, no crew patch, no mission patch has ever had horses on it that involve people. So some people are superstitious. All right, I think probably most of all of you probably recognize this, but I'm going to tell you something about this patch that I think might surprise you. So first of all, the circle represents planets. The stars represents the night sky. And you'll see this orbiting object around the word NASA, and that stands for, that represents space flight. But what is that red thing? What does that red thing represent? Well, NASA stands for National Aeronautic and Space Administration. That red thing represents aeronautics. But what is it? Well, as it turns out, it wasn't made up. It was inspired by a supersonic wing that, excuse me, that was in a wind tunnel years before NASA became NASA. And that shape inspired that element in NASA's emblem. All right. Valentina Tereshkova. She was a cosmonaut. She was the first woman to fly into space. She also happens to be the very first person to wear a mission patch. Very first person. No one in NASA, no one in the Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, ever wore a mission patch. She was the first. And it was sewn on a garment underneath her spacesuit. So she's the first person. In the United States, Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad are responsible for convincing NASA to allow them to design mission patches for their missions, the spaceflight missions. So if you want to acknowledge how did mission patches come to be? And this was not the first people who flew in space. There was a whole program called Mercury that happened before Gemini, the Gemini 5. But what's interesting is there is a Conestoga wagon. Really? How does that have anything to do with space? Well, you know what? These people were pioneers. They were exploring space. There was a time in which people didn't know if they could swallow food if they were in space in zero gravity. They didn't know because they hadn't been there. So the Conestoga wagon is a representation of the pioneering spirit of exploring space. And they thought the thing that it was emblematic of a pioneering spirit was what the pioneers used to get out west, and that was a wagon. Take note that on Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad's lapel is a astronaut pin. And astronaut pins are given to astronauts when they start to train to become an astronaut. And also when they fly into space. They get a silver pin when they are a candidate to become an astronaut. They get a gold pin when they fly in space. The very first mission patch to actually use that symbol was Apollo 14. Take a quick moment, lean in, look at this picture. I'm going to give you like 10 or 15 seconds. What I want you to do is I want you to scan all 12 of these patches and start to look for things that are similar. So take a moment, study the 4 patches, start to look for things that are similar. What is similar? Not for all, but for most. Okay. All right. All right. Did people recognize the astronaut symbol? That's in most of the patches. Another common element that you find in patches is the spacecraft. In this case, because these are space shuttle mission patches, you'll see representation of the orbiter in most of the patches. You'll see the Earth is a frequent element because space shuttle missions only orbited the Earth, just like the space station. And another common element is stars. Now, stars actually has a multiple meanings. It could mean the number of stars could be the number of crew. The stars could represent family and friends. It could also be a memorial to people that we've lost in the past. So stars can have multiple different meanings. These are the patches that represent the very first flight of each of the 5 space-worthy shuttle orbiters. Now, there were actually 6 orbiters. The 6th one is Enterprise, and it was the very first one. And it was used for test flights to be able to figure out how to fly the orbiter in Earth's excuse me, in Earth's atmosphere. But these patches represent the very first flight of each of the 5 orbiters. And one thing that you should know is that each of the 5 orbiters were named after a ship of exploration. And that is why some of these mission patches have tall sailing ships. Discovery and Endeavour, especially, they were named after ships of exploration. And Discovery has a unique story that I will share with you in a moment. But that's, spacecraft, especially the shuttle, were ships of exploration. And there's a history of explorers using ships to navigate to unknown places. And that's actually what the space shuttle did in space. Now we have SpaceX Crew Dragon missions. What I think is really, really cool about the Crew Dragon missions is it's got a dragon in it. That's really cool. Now these are patches that represent the very first, that first 8 Crew Dragon missions. There is one exception to this. It's a dragonfly. So actually, Crew Dragon, Crew 4, which is in the upper right, is a dragonfly, but it's got the word dragon in it. So close, right? They did that one time. They went back to using the dragon as a core motif. Now, Crew 7 is an interesting one because Crew 7 has a dragon that is sitting on top of the Earth with its tail wrapped around, and the star of the tail is actually where the spacecraft launched from. The head and the neck are in the shape of the 7. So these are things that I'm going to just clue you in on. You can look at different things. So look at Crew Dragon 3 up here with the Crew Dragon space capsule. There's actually a dragon head here, and it's actually in the shape of a flame. So, you can use your imagination to help to sometimes things hidden in plain sight makes the image that much more interesting, I think. So the space shuttle had 135 missions, 135 missions for the space shuttle program. Every one of those missions the space shuttle carried a payload. Now the payload could be the Hubble Space Telescope. It could be a laboratory, what's called a microgravity laboratory. It can contain materials to help to build the International Space Station. It contains in its payload experiments. So every mission of the space shuttle has a mission patch. So on the left-hand side is the mission patch for STS-31. STS-31 has the distinction of being the mission that launched the Space Hubble telescope. But every team that was involved with Hubble has their own patch. And every project and science team associated with the payload and experiments has their own patch. So out of 135 missions, there could be 4 to 10 experiments and projects and payloads, and every one of those teams has their own patch. So if you take 135, you multiply it by 10, you're over 1,000 patches that in its entirety represents the entire space shuttle program. So there are actually many more project and payload patches than there are mission patches because of that. So on the right-hand side is actually the project patch for the Hubble Space Telescope team. Here's another one. So there were experiments that were designed by students just like yourself, and experiments that were launched on a space shuttle, and experiments that were conducted in microgravity in space. And these are 2 patches that represent their experiments. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll see the outline of the orbiter on top of the body of a spider. And it turns out that experiment was about how do spiders create webs in zero gravity. On the right-hand side is an experiment to study how do ants react and behave in zero gravity. So these were actually experiments that were designed by students. Multiple schools were involved, and they were launched on space shuttle missions. This is just 2. There were a lot of these types of experiments that were launched. Deep space exploration. So we sent spacecraft to Mars. We sent orbiters, we sent landers, we sent rovers, 3 different kinds of spacecraft to Mars. On the left-hand side, the Mars Science Laboratory is at JPL in California. They were responsible for sending Curiosity, a rover, to Mars. On the right-hand side, back in July of 2020, the Perseverance rover was launched, and it was carrying the helicopter called Ingenuity. And by the way, Perseverance and Ingenuity were actually named by students like yourself. There was a contest. We also have things here on Earth called analog missions, and these are places on Earth that kind of feel and look like the moon or Mars. So on the island of Hawaii, there is a station to conduct experiments that represent or that replicate a lot of the conditions that you would experience on the moon or Mars. In the Arctic in Canada and in the deserts of Utah is a similar station. They each have their own patch because analog missions are actually missions, and there's a crew who actually perform and conduct that mission. Even though it's here on Earth, they have a patch. Now, I think it's a lot of fun. There's a set of patches called commemorative patches. Now, these were not real mission patches, but these were patches that were created to commemorate an event or an achievement. The one on the left is kind of one of my favorites. It's OSIRIS-REx. And OSIRIS-REx was a mission to take a spacecraft to take a sample or a bite out of an asteroid and return that sample back to Earth. I love the fact that someone thought of Rex, T-Rex. So of course, you're going to create a dinosaur that's taking a bite out of an asteroid. That is super, super cool. A friend of mine designed the patch on the right, and it commemorates the 3 missions in July of 2020, the 3 missions to Mars. So Perseverance was one I just mentioned. There was another spacecraft called Hope from the United Arab Emirates, and a spacecraft called the Tianwen from China. So each 3 of these countries launched a spacecraft to visit Mars at the same time because there's a window of opportunity. There are patches that are basically about science, about satire and fantasy. So on the left-hand side is an actual mission patch that was created for an episode of The Big Bang Theory, a TV series. Mike Massimino, who was actually an astronaut on 2 shuttle missions, both were servicing the Space Hubble telescope. They created a patch in the style of an actual mission patch. On the right-hand side was a patch that was created by a friend, an artist, and you'll see my name in the upper left-hand. He made me a commander for Mars 3. It was a made-up mission, but it was in the style of an actual mission patch. Okay, here are some of my favorite space shuttle patches. STS-7. STS-7 has the distinction of being the very first space shuttle mission in which the very first American woman went into space, flew into space aboard the shuttle. She was the first American woman astronaut to fly into space. And there's a couple things I want to say. So if I told you that actually the mission designation, the number 7 is represented somewhere in the patch, I'm hoping that you may have taken a note of it. Look at that. The robotic arm forms the number 7, which happens to be the mission designation 7. It also turns out there are 7 stars in the design. Each of those stars also represent the mission designation. So I told you stars are used for lots of different things. There's something that's also really cool. So here on the right is actually the sun, and there are 5, let me just take this back. There are 5 rays to the sun on the right-hand side of the orbiter. 4 of the rays represent 4 men who were crewed on this mission, and this ray in particular represents Sally Ride, who was the first woman. And these are actually symbols for female and male that are hidden in plain sight. All right, I told you that this patch was going to come up. This is one of my favorite stories. This story was told to me by Charlie Walker. You see Walker's name on the right-hand side. He was a mission specialist. He told me this story. It's one of my favorites, and I always love telling it, so I hope it's your favorite too. When I first looked at this mission patch, I went, okay, yeah, it's okay. It's interesting. Yeah, shuttle, sailboat. Yeah, it's kind of cool. Until I asked him, what do the stars represent? What is the meaning of the stars? And he told me this story. The story was the crew adopted a penguin as a mascot for the mission. Why? Because the Royal Research Ship Discovery, which is on the patch, circumnavigated Antarctica. And it was the first time human beings set eyes on emperor penguins. And that crew of that navigation, sailing research trip adopted a penguin as a mascot. So the crew of the Space Shuttle Discovery also wanted to adopt a penguin as a mascot. So the original design of this patch had a penguin in it, and NASA said, no penguin. Crew were disappointed, but they were not deterred. They challenged the artist that they worked with. We got to get a penguin into our mission patch. How did they do that? Well, they introduced stars. And when it was presented back to NASA for approval, NASA said, so there wasn't stars in the original design. What was the meaning of the stars? And with a straight face, the person said, well, that's the constellation Penguinus. And you can only see that from the southern hemisphere. Now, I'm here to tell you, there is no such thing as a constellation Penguinus. But what is really true is it is a penguin. And here is the Emperor Penguin. So like a lot of constellations, they could take a little liberty of where you draw the lines, but there is your Emperor Penguin. So they succeeded in getting an Emperor Penguin on their patch. That doesn't exist in the public. It's not published anywhere. This is a story that was told to me. I'm sharing it with you. And now I hope that this patch will forever be changed in your mind. All right, Anna Fisher. So she told me the story about her mission patch. And if you were to count the stars, there are 6 stars, but how many crew members are there? There's 5. So what about the 6th star? And it turns out it's this star over here on the right-hand side. That star represents Anna's daughter. And Anna has the distinction of being the first mother to fly into space. And she wanted a star on her patch to represent her daughter. And as it turns out, she now has 2 daughters. So she's actually commissioned my friend Tim Gagnon, and she now has a replica of this mission patch with 2 stars, each representing her daughter. So that's pretty cool. So Canadian Space Agency and European Space Agency astronauts. So these are astronauts that live and train in Canada or in parts of Europe. They have an interesting tradition. So unlike American NASA astronauts, Canadian Space Agency and European Space Agency astronauts like to create what is called a personal patch. So Robert Thirsk commissioned a patch to be created by an artist who is from a First Nation coastal Salish tribe in British Columbia to design a personal patch for him. So there are elements of coastal First Nation people elements within the design of this patch. So if you look at what is the eagle, is also kind of loosely in the shape of the orbiter, the space shuttle orbiter for STS-78. So here's the actual mission patch, and look at that. The same artist was involved in designing the actual mission patch for this mission, and it also uses elements from First Nation tribal art in the design of this patch. Here's a graphic version of that to see all of the detail. I think that's really cool. I love that. I love cultural influences on the design because these things, these are not just souvenirs. They actually have personal meaning and also represent the mission itself, but they're also very personal. Chris Hadfield is a Canadian Space Agency astronaut, and he has a reputation. He's part of a band that's made up of astronauts, um, and he played the guitar and sung songs on the International Space Station. So his personal patch is in the shape of a guitar pick. But you see the space station, you see elements that are personal to him, to Chris. One of my new favorites is Jeremy Hansen. Jeremy Hansen has been assigned to Artemis 2. And so he commissioned, like Robert Thirsk, he commissioned some First Nation artists to help him with designing his personal patch. Now, this one is quite involved. There's actually a video that's associated with it, but I'll just loosely tell you that it's a seven-sided shape. Each side is a place where there is an animal that is very culturally relevant to coastal Salish and Canadian tribes. And each of the animals represents a teaching. And so these shapes and these animals are very much part of the indigenous culture. And this is something that Jeremy Hansen, even though he doesn't come from a First Nation tribe, he himself wants to represent all of Canada and the people in Canada. And so he felt it was a privilege and an honor to be able to carry with him on his upcoming mission on Artemis 2, something that would help to represent and bring culture with him on this mission. So you'll notice a couple things in detail. You'll notice that there's a bow and there's an arrow. And the bow and arrow is very much a representative of Artemis. And I'll say a little bit more about Artemis later. But this bow is actually shooting an arrow, which is a metaphor for the launching of the spacecraft that will eventually take them back to the moon aboard their spacecraft. One thing I just recently learned, because I was a bit confused, underneath the word Canadian, and it's French Canadian on the left and it's English on the right, but underneath the word Canadian in English is the shape, and I really couldn't figure out what was that animal. It turns out to be Sasquatch, Bigfoot. So this Bigfoot, Sasquatch, as it's known in different places, is actually part of the folklore, part of the teachings for many indigenous people here in North America. I love sharing with you a story about someone you may not know, Alyssa Carson. So at the age of 5, Alyssa proclaimed to her father, "I want to be the first person to walk on Mars." And she dedicated her life and her choices in life since the age of 5 towards that goal. And she commissioned a friend of mine who's an artist. She commissioned a personal patch that represents her. So she went to space camp. She's done everything. She's gone to every space camp. She's gone to the Space University. She's a graduate of Emory-Riddle in Florida. She has trained and done as much as she possibly can. She's got her pilot's license. I mean, she is going for it. And she wanted a patch that represented when she was younger, represented who she is and what she is striving to achieve. And as it turns out, my friend Tim Gagnon, who is a premier emblem artist, was happy to accept her offer to create a personal patch for her. Tim Gagnon has created over 500 emblems. Almost without exception, almost all of them is related to space. 31 of his patches have flown in space. 18 of his patches are official NASA emblems that represents both space shuttle as well as expeditions to the International Space Station. So if you're an artist and you're enthusiastic about space, there is a place for you. There is something that you can do and you can contribute and you can offer, because emblems, in my opinion, are forever memories and commemoration. Now, I had the privilege of actually going to the place that made the patches that will get into the hands of educators that I donate. And this is AB Emblem in North Carolina. And at the time I visited the plant, they were making Expedition 70. So here are the embroidery machines that make all of these space patches, and they're the official manufacturer for NASA. As it turns out, people who go to the International Space Station have a mission patch too. And when Space Shuttle actually flew, not only did you have a space shuttle mission patch, but then you also had an expedition patch to the International Space Station. And as it turns out, when you fly to the International Space Station, the patch that you wear doesn't have crew names on it. The crew names are added after the crew comes back to Earth. So you actually get two patches, which is an awesome thing. I mentioned about the fact that the crew is responsible for their mission patch. But as a student, someone who, if you're interested in space and interested in mission patches, and you have, you just have an idea for a mission patch, I want you to not hold yourself back. Express yourself, explore your own sense of creativity and what is important to you. Now, the drawing on the left kind of looks like it was made by a kid. It turns out it was not. It was actually made by Joe Engel. He was the commander of STS-2. He loved to be involved in the design of his mission patches. And this is an actual drawing of what this mission patch was to become, but this was the first thing that he drew when he was thinking about his mission. Now, they went through a lot of iterations, a lot of changes. This is a mission patch that was created from this artwork, which was created by 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. They were a team of students, and there was an artist, and there was a student involved in that team who created a mission patch that represented their team. And they went forward and actually had a patch made for them. All right, second to the last slide here. I told you at the start, I was kind of a child of Apollo. You are of the Artemis generation. You are the next generation to explore space. But I want to tell you something about these two emblems because they are very much related to one another. Apollo and Artemis, according to Greek mythology, Apollo and Artemis were brother and sister. They were also very much what they call gods of the hunt. They used bows and arrows for hunting. Apollo, on the left-hand side, you see the A, and you see the Orion's belt. 3 stars form the cross to form the letter A for Apollo. And you see the Earth on the right, and you see the moon on the left, and you see a trajectory that kind of connects them. On the right-hand side is the official patch emblem for the Artemis program. And Artemis, the shape of the patch is the arrowhead of an arrow. The blue arc represents the horizon of Earth. The red path represents a path back to the moon, but going in a different way. And then it also uses, inside the design itself, it uses an upside down A to, again, represent Artemis. So they're very similar to one another, but there's also a connection through Greek mythology. And what I will leave you, before we open up for questions, what I'll leave you with is the idea that Artemis is about returning to the moon, but also setting your sights to go beyond the moon, back and to go to Mars. And you notice Artemis is holding her bow, and she is launching an arrow. And that arrow represents the launch vehicle that will launch the crew to the moon, but aiming beyond the moon to Mars. And the Latin phrase that you see in the border, et luna et Martem, means to the moon and Mars. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you. Everybody give a big thanks to Mr. Jaeren. That was amazing. I have a bunch of questions myself, but yeah, I've never seen such a wide array of mission patches. Growing up, you see the ones from the shuttle missions, but it was really cool seeing the Dragon ones and yeah, the individual patches from payloads. Before we get started, if you guys thought that was cool, I just want to remind you guys that STEAM4SPACE it's an organization, and if you check out their website, Logan has a lot of resources for educators on there that can help teams make a mission patch. So I would like you guys to encourage you guys to check that out. So for questions, this is how we will do it. I've got a couple of questions that have been sent to me directly in chat, and I'm happy to ask those. And so you can send them my way. I'm also happy to allow students and educators to ask questions directly, and we can kind of go back and forth. Logan, I don't know if you feel like you can manage monitoring the chat, maybe it's better, go ahead and send them to me instead of directly to Logan, since he'll be answering the questions in that way.
I
Doesn't
don't
have to
have
worry about
visibility
that.
of the
Okay.
chat that you're seeing. Yeah.
Okay, don't send them to Logan if you can, and you may not be able to, so that might not be. Okay, so we'll
Yeah.
start with I'll start off with a live question. We've got one hand raised, so if you're ready, are you ready, Logan, to take some questions?
I'm ready.
All right, let's go ahead. So Karen, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. I believe I'm unmuted.
Yep.
Yep.
I'm very interested in the shapes of the patches, and obviously the circle patch is the most common. And that seven-sided shape was very unique.
Mhm.
Do you have any knowledge of any like hourglass shapes or anything other than a, you know, typical shape? I mean, the arrowhead
I
was
have
cool.
identified. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead and
No,
finish your
I'm
question.
sorry. Yep, the arrowhead was cool. So that actually represented something. Are there any more like that?
I have identified around 80
Oh,
shapes.
wow.
Yeah. And I'm
Okay.
actually in the process of creating a stencil, digital stencil that could be used in Canva, as well as it could be printed out to be available for kids to choose, for educators to use as a resource for patch design. It turns out it's true. The circle shape is the most common, uh, primarily for economics. It's easier to make the round ones than it is to make other shapes. But now multiple shapes and complex shapes. Even Apollo 7 way back when, they were able to make, different shapes for patches. So what I find is some of the most interesting design of patches is ones that cut the border. Essentially, the design goes out from the center and essentially crosses the
Yeah.
border, or what I say, cutting the border. Yeah, there are multiple different shapes. The arrowhead obviously has some meaning in Greek mythology and indigenous cultures. Hourglass, it happens to be another shape that it has a reference in multiple cultures that means different things. Uh, I think the shape of the patch is very, not to overuse the word emblematic, but I think the shape of the patch is an important choice. Um, Sometimes it's used as convenience to get kind of everything you want into a specific shape. But yeah, there's lobe shapes, there's triangle shapes, these ellipses. And in fact, there's a connection to geometry. So math, right? Sometimes it's hard to tell the story about how does math fit into STEAM? How does it fit into space? Geometry is mathematics, and actually the geometry of shapes is a way to be able to introduce math into patch designs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Certainly a lot of math in those trajectory designs that are often on the patches.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll switch and we've got lots of questions in my chat, so I'll ask one here. And then again, don't hesitate to raise your hand if you want to ask a question live. Sometimes that's nice. From Chris Carnell, he noted that you mentioned some symbolism in the patches that were related to what happened during the mission. So
Yeah.
his question was, does that mean that the patches are made after the mission is over?
No. So the patches are often like there were some shuttle missions. The patch was created a year before the mission. Um, Most of the time, patches are usually made months before the launch of the mission. And the design, the prime crew, shuttle missions in particular, the prime crew were responsible for the design of their mission patch. And sometimes you'll see names that are added to the patch as a tag. It's actually sewn as a separate piece. Those are people who are added to the mission brief. Those are often mission specialists or payload specialists. And those people were not involved in the design or the design decisions for their mission patch because they were assigned to the mission much later after the patch was designed. So the only time a patch is actually created after the mission is with expedition patches. And that's because even leading up to weeks before one of those missions, sometimes the crew changes. And so the manufacturer's like, well, we can't keep up. So let's create the patch without names. And then whoever comes back to Earth for that mission, we'll add their names to it.
Yeah, I think he asked that after the Apollo 13 one, because that was one that also had like a last minute crew substitution.
Yeah. Ken Mattingly was actually taken off of the prime crew 2.5 days before launch. But there was an entire backup crew. The backup crew would train no different than the prime crew. So they could have switched the entire crew out and the mission would have been a success. I will tell you that Mercury patches, the emblems for Mercury missions and the first 2 Gemini missions were really created after those programs expired. And that was because collectors wanted patches.
Of course. Evelyn, I see your hand raised, but I'm going to skip to one more that got texted to me, and then I'm going to go to you, okay?
So I see that Evelyn has had her hand raised for.
Oh, has she? Okay, Evelyn, do you want to, I can unmute you, and can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Oh, we've got lots of little.
Go ahead, Evelyn.
What exactly are the Gemini missions?
What exactly are they?
The Gemini mission.
Your audio is breaking up, so.
This is glitchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought I heard your question. What are the Gemini missions?
Yeah.
So a quick recap of space history. Mercury was the very first crewed mission program in the US by NASA. And those missions only had 1 crew member. And all those missions did was go up into space, spend about less than 15 minutes, and come back to Earth. And that was done. Because again, they didn't know if they could like swallow, eat. They were trying things out. So everything was a learning experience. Gemini, which stands for the twins, which is poetic because Gemini had 2 crew members. And those 2 crew members actually orbited the Earth. So now they were spending more time. They had answered a lot of questions during the Mercury program. And now Gemini was to answer a whole bunch of other questions, except there were 2 crew members. Apollo was 3. And now they got to the place where they had test flights. So Apollo's 7, 8, 9, and 10 were all test flights leading up to Apollo 11 that actually landed on the moon. And that was the goal of the entire program.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Evelyn. Good question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I've got one more here from the chat. How long does it take to design a mission patch normally? I think you kind of already answered that, but what's normal for the artist to design one?
Are you talking about NASA mission patches?
Yeah, I mean, the question is more general. Victoria, I don't know if you want to chime in there, but yeah, we can. I think that one popped up when you were talking about the artist that worked with the astronauts to design the patches.
It varies widely. That's actually a great question. What I've heard circumstantially is that it can take months, and it's usually on the order of months. And during the early spaceflight missions, the astronauts would actually fly to North Carolina to visit AB Emblem on site to give feedback. But now things are done digitally, so they can do it much more quickly. Crews often, it's not a requirement, but crews often will partner with an artist. The artist will take their ideas if they don't actually have sketches of their own design. The artist will take the ideas that the crew want to incorporate into the design, and they'll work with the crew. They'll go through a lot of iterations, a lot of changes normally. But yeah, it's usually on the order of a few months at the shortest, and it can take up to a year at the longest. Yeah. Oh, by the way, artists that create mission patches that get flown in space, they are not paid.
That's crazy.
Their payment is the forever bragging rights that their design flew on a mission into space.
Wow. So it's a
they do not
project.
get paid.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's interesting. That's definitely something that I did not know. Okay, I'm going to switch over to a live question.
Okay.
Sarah, I see you have a hand raised.
Sarah.
Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
What is the coolest mission patch you have ever seen, and why was it your favorite?
I will tell you, Jeremy Hansen's mission patch that I showed you towards the end of the presentation is my new favorite. There is so much going on in that patch. There is so much meaning. There is so much personal, personal passion. So that's a personal patch. So that really is about Jeremy as an individual. In terms of the mission patch, there are two patches that to me are one of my favorites in terms of design. Apollo 8. To me, it's the simplest and the most perfectly designed patch for that mission. And the other one is STS-7 and STS-129. STS-7 I shared with you earlier. It's the mission that Sally Ride flew on, the first mission. I just love the simplicity of it, but also there's a lot of meaning. STS-129 is, oh my goodness, it is so rich, visually rich. There is a lot going on. And one of the things I will tell you, and I don't have it in front of me to show, so you're going to have to look up STS-129. That patch was actually created by my friend Tim Gagnon. And it turns out the stars in that mission patch design all represent the children of the crew. And one of the stars was for an unborn child. So Randy Bresnik, who was going to fly and to the International Space Station, his child was to be born during his mission. So knowing when the mission was going to take place, he added the star to the emblem. And they actually celebrated, the crew, the International Space Station greeted Randy with a onesie, a little baby onesie that actually had the mission emblem silkscreen on it. And that baby onesie is on display at Space Center Houston. So you can, after you visit Space Center Houston, you can see that onesie on display today. But that one star represented has, at that time, his unborn child that was born during the mission. But there's so much else going on in that design. It's so visually rich. So it's one of my favorites for that.
That's great. All right, we've got homework.
Yeah.
STS-129.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to switch over and let me ask a question quick from the chat here. How about some of these are.
I see Mac, Oregon.
Do you want to go with that for that one? Yeah, let's go with the Mac. Let's go live question. Why don't you guys unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
So this is a similar question to one that was asked recently, but what is your most valuable patch?
Oh, are they
You're
valuable?
getting really personal now. My most valuable patch is actually the crew patch for Apollo 7. And it's around $700.
Like,
Thank you.
sports cards. Okay, so the question I wanted to ask from the chat quick is, this is from Dory in Thompson Falls, Montana. And maybe you might not know the answer to this. If not, we'll just have to send the students out to find out. But
Okay.
what do you know what they found out about how spiders spin their webs in space and what the investigation was involving the ants?
You know, the spiders, it took them a while. They were able to make webs, but they weren't able to make webs in the same way they are accustomed to making them here on Earth. And that had to do with the fact, the influence of microgravity. So in microgravity, you don't have, if you're floating, you have nothing to push against. So if you're actually extracting the material to make your web, you really don't have any force against you to be able to spin a web in the beautiful manner which spiders are accustomed. The ants, I'm not familiar with the outcome of that study was, but it was a study to be able to look at how ant colonies, because they're a colony, does the effect of microgravity influence their behavior in terms of tunneling, nesting, and other things. So that's what that experiment was about. I don't know the outcome of that.
Very cool. There's some curious students.
It turns out those two experiments that I showed you patches for were on board a Columbia.
Okay.
Columbia's fatal flight.
Oh, okay.
So, but it turns out that the data that was collected during flight for those experiments was saved. But there were aspects of those experiments that was lost because of the breakup and burnup of Columbia.
Okay. All right, we'll go for another live question. Isis? I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, it's Isis.
Isis McCall.
I was wondering, what are the qualifications required to be able to request an individual mission patch?
That's a good question.
What are the requirements? So I can share with you some aspects of Tim Gagnon's experience because he was inspired to start creating mission patches at the age of 17 with the launch of Apollo 17, who was created by an artist that he reveres. It takes years of patience. You have to develop a reputation, and you have to be willing to actually kind of give away your art and suggestions, and you have to be persistent. That's what's been consistently told to me by various artists. Oftentimes, it's developing a rapport and relationship, and essentially inviting yourself to create a design for consideration. So it's really about at first establishing some relationship or rapport with those people who are going to be involved in the mission. Sometimes that's the hardest part is developing that connection. Sometimes it's putting your artwork out there. You know, it's like thinking about an upcoming mission, doing research and study about what that mission objectives are about, learning a little bit about the crew who are going to be on that mission, and actually creating a prototype design, putting it out there and inviting others to take a look at it. I belong to a Facebook group called Space Hipsters, and Space Hipsters is made up of over 64,000 members, and we're all enthusiasts of one type or another. But there's astronauts, there's retired people from NASA, there's active members of NASA who are part of that group. So that actually is a pretty good group to be able to socialize ideas for designs and to invite people to connect with you.
Yeah.
All right, we've got time for a few more questions. I've got a lot of good ones in the chat. I'm just going to ask, there's a lot of questions on numbers, like how many patches have made. I know you mentioned that, and like how many patches have actually been sent to space. And then I'll give you one more question that's kind of straightforward. What are the materials that are normally used to make the patches?
So most often patches are made from embroidery thread. Sometimes they're cotton, oftentimes they're a metallic or a polyester thread, depending on the detail that you want to get out of an embroidery. When you create graphic art, a lot of the detail gets lost when you actually make an embroidered version of the patch. But technology, part of STEAM, technology and engineering and machines that actually make patches are getting better and better. Now, as it turns out, patches made of fabric. So far, they have stood the test of time. They have lasted decades, a long time. There are new materials being used for making patches. One's called PVC. It's a plastic. And right now, there's a lot of debate about the longevity of PVC patches. Are they going to last as long as the embroidery? It's a personal preference. I actually don't like PVC patches because when you hold one, it just doesn't feel the same. And when you put it up against the light, you know, yeah, it has a lot of detail. It's essentially is a plastic version of the graphic art. The embroidery isn't perfect, but that imperfection adds something to, I think, the appreciation of the patch itself. When you take an embroidered patch and you you tilt it in the light, it has a sense of relief, has a sense of, you know, detail, and you know, it's meant to be wearable. Yeah.
Do you know about any, I'll just ask this question quick. Do you know about any resources for students if they want to get their own embroidered mission patch made? Is that something?
Yes, there are actually quite a few services that actually, I actually made my first patch with the help of my artist, Tim. I created a patch for STEAM4SPACE. It was the very first one. It was a collaboration with Tim, who's an artist. And then I essentially contracted with a company that makes embroidered patches, and I ordered a lot. I ordered hundreds. The student patch I showed you in the presentation is something that educator does every year for her classes, and each family, each patch costs about $8. But what they did is that they took the sketch, the drawing that you saw, they gave that to the artist at the company that they contract with. And that graphic artist made refinements and then made it possible to make into an embroidered patch. And it cost each of those families $8 per patch. Not a bad deal when you think about that patch now as kind of a forever emblem. Yeah, so there's quite a few companies that actually do embroidery.
That's great. Okay, I'm gonna go for another live question here, and this
Okay.
we'll do one more live question, then we'll see what time it is. So Todd, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? If that's not your real name, you can. Their names
Hi.
on your name.
What are the bigger steps you took to become a NASA expert?
You know, it was curiosity. I had collected, because my grandfather gifted me a set of patches when I was a kid. It turns out that those patches were stolen when I was a young adult. So I lost those patches. But I found myself in the summer of 2018, I found myself at Kennedy Space Center in the gift shop. Oh, yeah. So a few hours later, I walked out with a new collection. But what I was transfixed by was the design, which is something that was new to me. I had seen these patches throughout my life, but now I was looking at them differently. I was actually wondering, what is the story behind this design? Why was it designed this way? What is that? There's a lot of information online about, especially the earlier patches. So it was curiosity. I wanted to know the origin story behind this design. What did it mean to the people who created it? And because it means something different to me, but now I understand what it meant to the crew who created these designs. And the more I did research, the more I uncovered these human interest stories. Because, you know, I'm one of those people who goes to page 29 in a Google search result to find that little nugget of something that is meaningful. I started to learn more about human interest stories, like how a 10-year-old boy on the island of Guam prevented a loss of telecommunication with the Apollo 11 command module as it was returning through Earth. A 10-year-old boy, right? I never heard about that. And so then I went on to another patch, kind of went through and, you know, discovered this. And what I ended up doing is I ended up through this research, essentially starting to now publish what I was learning and discovering. And now I make that available through Scenes of Space. So the patches that I donate actually have a design story that leads to STEM, leads to understanding what the payloads are, what the mission objectives are. So that's how I started. It was actually just curiosity. So, you know.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, that's a perfect question, I think, to end on, because hopefully you guys are feeling curious and inspired and have some great ideas about what to put in your own mission patch. I want everyone to please give Logan a big thank you for spending this time with us and sharing his knowledge and everything he's learned over a lifetime of curiosity with us. And just to wrap it up, Logan, I just want to give you, if you want, an opportunity to share about your resources or say some final words, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
So just in short, I have a complete lesson plan that is focused on the patches that are being donated through NESP out to educators. So the mission patches that you are receiving are part of a comprehensive lesson plan, in which I include slides and presentations of varying lengths, depending on whether you want a quick 20-minute lesson or you want to make it a 2-day lesson. Included in that is actually a small group activity that I created. It was inspired actually by an activity that I learned at the Space Exploration, Space Exploration Educator Conference around designing your own experimental aircraft. And I adapted that to designing your own mission patch. And so it's actually a small group student activity that allows 3 to 6 students to assume a role, whether the commander, the pilot, or mission specialist, or payload specialist, as a part of an activity that forms in a small group or team, essentially exercises how crews work together and collaborate together to solve problems, and essentially to define not just their mission patch, but also their mission. So that's available. And all of this is free. The other thing I will plug is I collaborate with Apollo 13 astronaut Fred Hayes. So Fred Hayes and I actually offer for free a session in which there is a short curriculum of activities that lead up to an hour-long one-on-one Q&A session with Fred Hayes about Apollo 13. So that's available through my website. There's a number of free events similar to this talk, so you can invite me back to a classroom to kind of give, and you can pick your own topics, kind of a la carte menu. What do you want me to share? So that's, my goal is essentially is to inspire interest in space, and having students hold real mission patches really transforms the learning experience. And so I really appreciate the opportunity of speaking directly with you, and thank you very much for this opportunity.